When is conflict helpful and when is it not in groups? We get asked this quite a lot, Jane Martin and myself, in running trainings around group facilitation. And, I'm a huge advocate of leaning into conflict and really leaning into our differences and harnessing it for purpose. I really think that we don't go into it enough and it's super necessary in groups. But also, sometimes it actually just isn't a good idea. And so the question we get asked a lot is, well, how do you know? How do you know when it's good to go into conflict and to lean in and go there, and when it's really not good and it's going to cause more harm? It's a challenge a lot of facilitators grapple with. So, in some ways that's hard to talk about because obviously it depends on context, but there are some patterns you can identify to help you decide whether to go into it or not. And so I thought I'd just spend today just outlining a few points or reasons of why not to go into conflict when it's not a good idea. So the first one is when you don't have time to deal with it in some way. So you don't have the time put aside to deal with it properly. Bear in mind, though, that time itself can often be used and is often used as an excuse for not going into conflict. So maybe check that out. So if you feel like actually we don't have the time to do this, maybe just ask yourself the question, is that really true? Or is it just that we're putting it off? Or is it really actually we're in a crazy time right now and we really don't have the energy or the space to go into that, in which case it's not a good idea to go into. The second one is kind of when you're not really invested in committing to work through it. Because, conflict is often tricky and it involves energy and kind of working through stuff. And it might be completely valid that you don't have the energy or the commitment to work through it right now. It might be that there are other priorities. But either way, it's really good to be super clear about that, actually, and be explicit about that, we don't have the time to do it right now. Or it might be that, you talk about that or bring it to the table, but you be explicit about it because half going into it is worse. So I often think about, when I was a kid, I used to do gymnastics. And, when you're doing a really tricky trick on the beam or something like that, like a difficult trick, we were taught you got kind of go into it 100% or not at all, because pulling out halfway is when you get really injured. And it's a similar principle. It's kind of, you need to commit to going into it. And if you think you're kind of half going into it, wait for a better time. The third one is when there's not a good or solid holding container for the work to actually go into it. And what do I mean by that? So, for example, you don't have a dedicated time enough, like you don't have a dedicated process or a dedicated time for it where people are actually really actively engaged. It might be that you've got time put aside, but people have to come and drop in and drop out and kind of are half there. It's not a good solid holding container for this sort of work. So you need people to actually be there for a dedicated time. And even if that's small, it's actually just about being explicit and going, we're going to commit an hour of dedicated time to this every week for a certain amount of weeks, but you're clear and explicit boundaries around it. Super important in this work. Another point, and this is mainly for facilitators coming in and consulting in this sort of work, is when you're not clear on the power dynamics at play in the background, or you don't have a good read on the amount of buy-in from leadership on actually surfacing the conflict. So that can have, very real implications for people in the group. Like if you're going in and getting everybody to surface a whole lot of stuff, but leadership has no real intention of doing anything beyond that, then that's going to be counterproductive for those people in that group and potentially even unsafe. So we need to think about, as facilitators, when you're going in, getting a really good sense of what the buy-in is around that. And again, if you don't have that, that's okay. It's more about kind of knowing that that's the first step of the work, is getting clear on that. Or that the next step is to actually get that information in some way from your contracting body or from the authorising body. And that just protects participants when you're doing that sort of work. The other one is when you don't have time put aside at the end to integrate the information that's surfaced from going into it. So, a lot of conflict doesn't get resolved in one go. It rarely does. But leaving people with just kind of a sense of the feeling of surfacing stuff, but it not going anywhere, it doesn't feel good in a group. So even if you can frame the boundary of the time, but dedicate time at the end to some sort of integration process of next steps, even talking about, well, this came up, and so what might this mean for us, and what are our next steps, is really important within each part of the process. So the next steps might be, we need to work more. We've brought this up and this up and this up, and now we know we need to work more on it. When are we going to do that? But putting aside that time, so you're not kind of leaving people sitting with just a whole lot of emotion and no sense of where it's going. So that's really important. So I guess they're just kind of a few different pieces around when it's not good to go into conflicting groups. And as I said before, like, that really doesn't mean not to do it. It just means that maybe your work first is to work on the conditions, required for you to be able to go into it. So it's just more like you're at a different stage of the process. And so, okay, actually my work here at the moment is establishing the conditions. So I guess if you're a facilitator that is, maybe feeling like you really want to be able to harness conflict and difference in groups, it's important, but you're feeling a little bit ill-equipped. It's really natural because we're kind of so conditioned to be so fearful of it. But you really want to be able to hold your own and, I guess, know when to go into it and when not to go into it. Know how to catch conflict early before it escalates into something that can be more problematic. To make the exchanges that come up in conflict really meaningful and valuable for your groups, and really just to feel a bit more confident, so that you've got a few things in your toolbox and you feel more able to handle whatever comes up, whatever presents in a group. Then really encourage you to enroll in our Working with Conflict in Groups course that I run with my colleague Jane Martin, and we've got one coming up. Enroll now. We hope to see you there. Thanks.